We've already found out that everything's made up from atoms, gazillions of tiny particles, far too small to see even with a microscope. But how do you know that this is what atoms look like? Let's look at the history of how we found this out. About 2,000 years ago, there was a Greek philosopher called Democritus who worked out that everything's made up from tiny particles called atoms. We continued to think this until about 100 years ago, when scientists were able to use technology to start looking properly at how these atoms work and what they're made up from. It was a British scientist called J.J. Thomson who worked out that atoms were made up from more than one thing. He discovered the electron. Thomson thought the negatively charged electrons were stuck in a positively charged atom, kind of like blueberries stuck in a blueberry muffin. Then in 1911, along came a New Zealand scientist called Ernest Rutherford. Rutherford performed an experiment that became very famous, and is still now referred to as Rutherford's gold leaf experiment. What Rutherford did was take a piece of gold leaf, this is gold but rolled into very thin pieces of paper, and surrounded it with sensors. He then started firing tiny particles at it that could be detected by his sensors. Everyone knows that gold is very dense, so obviously he expected his test particles to bounce off it, but this didn't happen. Instead, what he found was that most of the particles went straight through the gold leaf. How is this possible? It's like kicking a ball at a wall, only to find that it goes straight through it. Were the particles disappearing and reappearing on the other side? Were they breaking through the gold and then repairing the whole after themselves? His conclusion was that the gold wasn't solid. It was actually full of gaps, and his test particles were passing through these gaps. Rutherford realised that the atoms making up the gold weren't solid balls at all. They were made up mostly of empty space which the test particles could fly through. An atom has a positive centre called a nucleus, and the negative electrons are whizzing around the outside of it. Rutherford was able to calculate that for his test particles to pass through the gold, the amount of the space between the nucleus and the electrons must be huge. So big, in fact, the atoms were made up almost entirely of empty space. In fact, if we expand an atom to the size of a football stadium, so that the electrons are whizzing around the outside of the stands, then the nucleus would be the size of a small marble placed in the middle of the pitch. So Democritus said that everything is made up from small atoms. J.J. Thomson said these atoms are positive particles, with negative electrons embedded in them, like a blueberry muffin. And Rutherford worked out that the atom was a positively charged nucleus with negatively charged electrons surrounding it, but that it's mostly empty space. So everything's made from atoms that have a positive nucleus that's surrounded by negative electrons. But what's in the nucleus? That's a story for another day.